Good day, everyone, and welcome to The Literary Machine. I am your host, K.O. Lynn. If you're unfamiliar with this podcast, I dive into stories of popular media and analyze how effective I think the storytelling is. I post a new podcast episode every other Wednesday with 10 episodes in a season. Be sure to subscribe on my website to be notified when the next episode drops. At this moment, I actually have a poll on my website about whether to stream games. Let's Plays are a legitimate means of experiencing everything a game offers. In the Literary Machine's case, I will be taking the opportunity to do in-depth story analysis into some of the most solid stories that gaming has to offer, like Final Fantasy X, Little Nightmares, Alien Isolation, Horizon Zero Dawn, and more. If this interests you, please go to my website to vote. Links will be below. Today, I will be talking about the story of Final Fantasy X. If this is a game you still haven't played and would like to, consider this your warning that spoilers lie ahead. Final Fantasy X, published in 2001, is the last installment in the franchise that was created solely by the company Squaresoft. After 10, it merged with Enix to become Square Enix. This just so happens to be my first ever Final Fantasy. I did not grow up with Nintendo and wasn't fully aware of the series on PlayStation, but I bought this one because it was advertised on Toonami, of all places. Isn't that a throwback? I'm all about those cool monster designs, characters, and fantasy elements, so I was intrigued by the commercial. Lo and behold, I was pretty bad at it. I had to restart in a few different places because I kept getting stuck on the bosses. First one was at Operation Mayhem. Second was the Albed Machina on Lake Macalania. I struggled against the first Seymour battle, Every the Giant Worm, and Seymour on Mount Gagazet. I think some of y'all know what I'm talking about. Those were some gnarly fights. I did eventually complete the game, and I absolutely loved the story. You bet I bought the remastered edition when it was released in 2013. I replayed it, and now that I know how those boss fights work, most of them were easy. Usually, when you revisit a property as an adult that you loved as a child, opinions can change. I used to love The Little Mermaid as a kid, but when I rewatched it as an adult, I was less impressed. On the opposite end, I remember loving Beauty and the Beast as a kid. Not thinking much of it, but then I rewatched it as an adult and thought it was a fantastic film. Might be because I relate to Belle more than Ariel. I'll take the Beast Library any day of the week. Well, upon revisiting Final Fantasy X as an adult, I find the story still thoroughly engaging. The characters felt alive and familiar, and I admit I still cried at some of the more impactful scenes, namely the ending. When laid bare, it is still a fundamentally engrossing story. But wow, some of those stilts are a bit shaky. Before I begin the analysis, I like to give a brief overview of the story. The main playable character is Titus, a blonde, happy-go-lucky pro athlete. And yes, I will be calling him Titus. I don't care what Enix says about the pronunciation of the name. Moving on. He's in the middle of a big game when a giant monster attacks his city. During the attack, a family friend named Orin meets up with him to guide him safely into the waiting arms of the monster itself. The monster takes Titus and Orin. When next Titus wakes up, he's alone and in a foreign place. A series of fortunate and unfortunate events happen, and eventually Titus is rescued by a strange girl and her crew, though they speak a foreign language because they are a race of people called Albed. They press gang him into working for them. The girl who helped him is the only one who understands his language, and they soon hash out that Titus has apparently been transported 1,000 years into the future. Unfortunately, the monster interrupts them and makes off with Titus again. This time, Titus washes up on the beach of Besaid Island, where he meets most of the rest of the cast. He meets a young woman named Yuna, who's a summoner, and together they embark on a journey to destroy this monster, which is called Sin because it is thought to be a divine punishment for humanity's vanity. Sin goes around this world and destroys whole villages and towns, killing men, women, and children. The religion that has sprung up to combat sin is called Yevon and has a huge role in the story. Along the way, the characters do a bit of light treason. In this case, treason is defined more as something that the leaders of Spirit didn't like unless it actually being against the law. For instance, it's against the law to let the dead wander because there's a chance they'll turn into small monsters called fiends that will prey on the living. But then a dude named Seymour is killed by the group, and that's a whole other can of worms because it was technically done in self-defense and wanders around as a dead person, and the leader of Spira, Maester Micah, is also undead. So, yeah, Yuna and crew are forced to flee and do things their own way. There are typical things about it, and then there are things that are ostentatious, to say the least. Final Fantasy X is one of my favorite games, but I first want to focus on the negative aspects. Hear me out. I can give you a laundry list of things that did not age well. Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy to feature voice acting, and wow, they used it everywhere that they could, which honestly is fantastic, but I'll revisit that. The voice of Tidus is James Arnold Taylor, best known for voice acting Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Clone Wars series. Wakka is voiced by the legend John DiMaggio, who's the voice for Bender in Futurama. Tara Strong is the voice of Riku, who is Bubbles from the Powerpuff Girls, and so many more voices. Despite being some seriously amazing voice actors, they didn't always have the best direction. There's bad dialogue, awkward pauses, it can be tonally off here and there. The main character, Tidus, refers to his father mostly as old man, and it sounds so dated and unnatural. The lip syncing for the English voices is absolutely terrible. It looks like they didn't even try, but you do get used to it. There are tons of canned animations. Characters have very specific animations that they do when they're awkward or cheering, and it just repeats over and over, which is so very unlike the full motion capture that game productions like The Last of Us do, because that kind of technology was expensive and only reserved for the full motion video scenes. And some of the actions that the characters take to convey body language can be so strange. If I'm honest, the canned animations are the worst part. Everyone talks about the infamous laughing scene. It is awkward. Like, The Office is awkward, but if you see it in context, it doesn't seem so strange or weird, especially if you see it knowing the whole story already. Another large complaint is about the game mechanics, which I'm going to gloss over since it's less pertinent. Other Final Fantasies had a real-time gauge during battle where you had to make your move once the gauge filled up. There is no real-time gauge in 10. You could literally leave your controller and your characters would remain in the same spot and at the same health until you returned. Since I didn't grow up with the original gameplay the Final Fantasy games are known for, it didn't bother me. Frankly, I liked it without the real-time gauge, but that's a discussion for a different forum. So many of these complaints, though, are a result of the limited technology at the time and can be largely forgiven. Just temper your expectations. By contrast, I've heard very few complaints about the story. They're there, I'm sure. This is a game made by a Japanese company in Japan. It takes a huge amount of cultural influence from its country of origin and puts it into the story, which usually makes it seem a bit weird and strange to Westerners. I personally enjoyed it because it was a fresh take on several standard cliches. Largely, it seems that most people agree that this is a story with great characters, strong themes, and lots of heart. Frankly, some of the stranger parts of the story are not what initially grabbed my attention as weak points. For instance, there's an entity called Yevon who created a huge monster to live in so that he could be safe while summoning the Dream Zanarkand. But at the same time, the monster armor known by the citizens of Spira as Sin is wreaking havoc across the world, killing untold numbers of people. If you're having trouble parsing that, yes, it is a major plot point of the game. It's hella weird, but different and refreshing. When you get all the little details of the story, it does actually make sense within the context of the world. There are parts of the story that are weak, and most of that weakness comes in around Operation Mihin. For those unaware, Operation Mihin is a plan by non-playable characters to lure the monster Sin into a bay so that it can be killed by a huge array of cannons and a giant laser beam. It goes badly, and it's a story arc meant to showcase just how terrible and powerful this monster called Sin is. At any rate, your characters have to casually move on because you're guarding a summoner, and summoners are the only known people who can defeat Sin and temporarily break the cycle. Operation Mihin is about 12 to 15 hours into the game, and your party is 6 people strong at this point. But then you gain a 7th person. The character is Riku, a teenage girl that the main character Titus first meets in the early hours of the game. She's back, and she's there because she tried to kidnap the summoner Yuna. They don't disguise this at all. Suddenly she joins the party. You later find out that she's a cousin to the summoner Yuna, but at the time it's so abrupt and weird, it just seems very odd that no one in the entire group questioned her presence when all they did was question Titus's presence before he officially joined. It's really odd, and given how far into the game it is at this point, it feels like maybe Riku would have been better served as a character if she'd been introduced a little bit earlier. Her people, the Albed, had a huge presence in Operation Mihin. It doesn't seem all that far-fetched for her to be caught up in that. What if she ended up aiding the group in battle or giving aid in a cutscene? I think it would have worked. As is the case with stories, if you change something significant about them, you'd have to rework a lot of the scenes around it to accommodate. Riku attempting to kidnap Yuna has very strong implications for the depth of her race's actions and references another significant plot point down the road. Granted, said plot point is implicated a lot in this game, so cutting out one reference I don't think would have hurt. Next, the group moves to Guado Salam, where the leader of the Guado and a maester of Yevon, Seymour Guado, proposes to marry Yuna. She decides to visit the far plane where the dead rest. Yes, there is a heaven of sorts that can be physically visited. She sees her parents there. This is where the story becomes less coherent. When Titus interacts with Yuna at the far plane, we don't hear whatever she might have been saying to her parents. She just says, "I've decided." That's it. She doesn't tell you what her decision is. She further says, "I must do what Spira wants, not just what I want." Another character later says, defeating Sin will make people happy. Marrying would also make people happy. To me, this suggests that it's just 2 different stops on the same path. Everything in the dialogue suggests that Yuna intends to go through with the marriage to Seymour. Then, as you're exiting the far plane, the ghost of Seymour's father appears and he drops a physical object. Yuna is made to use her powers to return Seymour's father to his resting place on the far plane and takes the object. Another one of your party members, Oren, suggests that because the ghost appeared, it had unfinished business, which doubly means that he died an unclean death. Yuna goes to Seymour's home alone to deliver her news, but Seymour isn't there, so the party moves on because he's further down the road. During the next setting, the party stops at an inn and Yuna gets a room. Titus eavesdrops and stupidly falls in, but he sees a hologram of Seymour's father that Yuna is watching. The object that the ghost dropped is basically a holographic video recorder called a Severe. Titus gets into trouble for barging in on Yuna. After they leave the inn, Yuna decides she needs to tell the group something. She then says, "I've decided to marry." One of the party members says, "Why'd you change your mind?" Excuse me? She changed her mind? All the way up to this point, we've had no idea what Yuna was going to say. Yet the story goes with the presumption that Yuna originally was going to decline, which doesn't make sense in light of all the context clues that we got. This area of the game is just so bizarre and puzzling. It could simply be that between scenes, it is presumed that Yuna spoke separately to other party members, initially telling them she was going to decline before changing her mind. Perhaps that's why Titus seemed to feel so betrayed by that scene, since he is our main POV. Never mind that he's clearly jealous and dislikes Seymour for his interest in Yuna. Later, it turns out that Seymour is one of the main villains, and he was originally going to use Yuna for his own terrible ends. This begins the better part of the story, where the party becomes fugitives and are found guilty as traitors to the government. All of this is kicked off by a ghost, an ethereal being with no physical presence, dropping an item. That is such a flimsy means of starting that story arc that it's kind of incredible that it works. It probably shouldn't, and would seriously recommend that any storyteller worth their salt had better think of a cleaner way of getting that sphere into Yuna's hands. I think it works in part because the game doesn't really allow you to question it. After Seymour's father appears, it just focuses on the spectacle of it. Yuna is the only one who saw the sphere and is the only one who can comment on it, but she doesn't. It could also be that it works because most people who are still playing the game at this point have definitely been drawn into the story and are more open to the world of spirit and its peculiar world building. For all we know, ghosts can hold physical objects on spirit, despite the fact that they're just as insubstantial as ghosts on Earth are supposed to be. Now, when pointing out flaws where I think the story is weak, I like to suggest solutions to make these criticisms more constructive. Perhaps there could have been a chase scene where Guado was running away and we see the sphere slip from his pocket and only Yuna sees it. Or, what if Guado is running away from the guards and runs into Yuna, dropping the sphere, and she picks it up then? Or, what if Guado was sneaking around Guado Salam and he accosts Yuna, getting in real close to her to give her the sphere? There are a number of ways this could have been done that would have made more sense than a ghost dropping the sphere. Perhaps the reason they decided to use Seymour's father to deliver the sphere was to impress upon the player the significance of the sphere to begin with. If it was delivered by other means, you'd think it's suspicious perhaps, but maybe not wholly significant? As I said earlier, they focus on the consequences of the ghost appearing at all to skate by the significance of it dropping the sphere in the first place. There is, of course, another potential reason for this, and it comes down to culture. This may be very specific to Japanese storytelling and their culture, so I could be completely off base in making these suggestions. But I am taking the story strictly at face value without regard to history or culture or author influence. Whether that's the case or not, I do want to acknowledge it as a possibility. It still works as an inciting incident to drive the plot arc. But how does it do that? It raises the stakes for the characters. There's Seymour proposing to Yuna. His father appears to basically deliver a message, and then Aaron suggests that Seymour's father was murdered, all in a very short span. This significantly increases the intrigue, and it makes the player all the more curious to see what this is all about. This is definitely the point where the story really kicks into high gear. Everything before this point in the story had varying significance, mostly serving to develop the 5 new characters in your party, introduce you to the world of spirits so you can start learning its history and lore, and it emphasizes the enormous shadow that's in cast over everyone's lives in this world. While slow burn often refers to romance that takes a significant chunk of the story to get to the point where the characters express their love for one another, I also like the term to refer to stories that take a long time to get to the real meat and potatoes. When you first meet Yuna, to her, Titus is just some random guy who washed up on the beach and then ignored religious tradition, potentially putting her career in jeopardy. She treats you well and seems to think Titus has some connection to a man named Jecht. Turns out that Jecht was the name of Titus's father. The point is, though, that you don't know each other, so for it to make sense for you to travel with her, there's a plot arc about there being a blitzball tournament in the same direction that Yuna's headed. Titus is a pro athlete after all, so Waka ropes him into playing on the Besaid Oryx. I might as well talk about it. Easily the worst part of Final Fantasy X, at least for me, is the blitzball. From what I understand, it's a combination of water polo and rugby, and I think the devs do a really poor job of endearing you to the game. For narration's sake, you only ever have to play one game. Because it's the one game, they make some rare creative choices that are infinitely more frustrating for the player, which is a bit strange and unorthodox. I keep mentioning that Titus is some pro player, but his stats in the first game suck. He barely has enough to make a single goal, and that's if you're lucky. Then they put you on the statistically worst team in the game. This isn't Rudy or Remember the Titans. Your teammates are absolutely terrible. The story literally does not guarantee that you win the tournament. You can lose it, and Titus can let Waka down with all of his promises of winning. Usually, it does mean, though, that when the story finishes the blitzball tournament, the majority of players never want to touch another game. If you do touch another game, it's hopelessly tedious and dull. Remember, Final Fantasy X was released in 2001, so the AI is horrendous and the game is just clunky. Even though you disappoint Waka, he just kind of shrugs it off, which Waka is a good guy, but it would have been nice to see Waka express his disappointment to Titus. Story-wise, the blitzball tournament really slows down the pacing and clunks up the beginning. The blitzball tournament is really just a point in the story that the player suffers through, generally more than they enjoy. They do their best to move you past it pretty quickly, because a single game is bookended by two dramatic events. First, Yuna gets kidnapped by the Albed. Yes, this plot point will reoccur. And then suddenly a bunch of monsters come out of nowhere and attack the players and fans in the Blitzball Stadium. Seymour calls an Aeon that hasn't yet been seen in the game and destroys nearly all the monsters by his lonesome. You might think this plot point is a silly cop-out to create some action and drama, and you might be right, but there actually is an explanation for it. But more on that later. It would be interesting to see if Square Enix ever revisits Blitzball and makes a whole package sports game out of it with the technology that's available today. For the most part, the rest of the story is cohesive. That's not to say there aren't plot holes or potential problems. For instance, your entire party is put on trial for treason, and you, indeed, are found guilty of treason, which means execution. Now, some might think, oh, is there a jailbreak? Is there some kind of fancy guillotine? Oh no. Yevon's method of execution is throwing your characters into a monster-infested area called the Via Purifico with your weapons. The only hamstringing is that some of your characters are swimming and some aren't, so the party's split. But otherwise, they literally just leave you to your own devices. After gate-crashing a wedding that had some heavy defense, you'd think the leaders of this government would reconsider their methods to make sure your characters are truly dead. Seymour does volunteer to check and make sure the party dies, but mostly the government just washes their hands clean of this. I have seen some speculation that the major religion, Yevon, doesn't actually believe in the death penalty, and that throwing you to the wolves is as close as it can get. That way, if you die, no one in Yevon personally did it, and it's fate. But that is pure speculation. There is nothing in the dialogue or in any exposition anywhere that this is the case. We have no idea what Yevon's stance is on the death penalty. For something as serious as execution for treason, it's a seriously weak punishment. And it's kind of silly that they couldn't think of a better means of getting the party out of it. Why not a jailbreak? It would make more sense since the characters are pretty strong at that point, but it's probably because the game was long enough and to add another sequence would have been too much padding. Whatever the reasoning, That's the way it is. One of the last parts of Final Fantasy X that might wear a bit thin is Seymour himself. The very first boss battle you have with him, you kill him. He dies. But because death works quite a bit differently in this game, and because he has such a powerful emotion and strong ambition, he doesn't go to the world's equivalent of heaven. He stays in the regular world as an unsent, keeping his humanoid body, but he's not fully corporeal either. A ghost, but he can change clothes and hold items. This is the kind of video game logic that would give physicists headaches, but you have to roll with it. After you kill him the first time, you have not one, not two, but 3 more boss battles against him. He just never seems to go away, and that simultaneously turns him into a nuisance and makes him increasingly less threatening with every encounter. Even the main characters start to act annoyed. Titus says something along the lines of, "You again?" I'd like to actually address the problem of Seymour in a different podcast because I find the overuse of certain villains a frequent issue in media. As far as suggesting improvements to Seymour as a villain, the first solution, of course, would be to cut at least one of the boss battles. It felt like the creators were leaning on the "if you didn't see him die, then he's not actually dead" trope as the only hints that Seymour was going to return. Apart from him just appearing, there are only ever 2 hints in the game as to Seymour's whereabouts. They could have done more to hint that maybe Seymour's not entirely done, rather than just throw boss battles around. At any rate, I think I've talked enough about some of the more negative aspects of Final Fantasy X. So let's start gushing about the things that they did right and perhaps zero in on why this game is such a mainstay in the entire Final Fantasy series. I could be wrong, but it seems to clock in as the second most beloved Final Fantasy after Final Fantasy VII, obviously. I mentioned at the beginning that the story has quite a slow burn, taking 6 to 8 hours to really get underway and draw you into the world of Spirit and its drama. The first couple of hours when you're alone with Titus, the game focuses very heavily on his character and personal trauma. He's lived the last 10 years thinking his father is dead, and then when the monster called Sin grabs him, he is forcefully reminded of him. Then we see bad dreams and memories that show how much of a jerk this guy was as a father to almost everyone, especially his own son. As a child, Titus wasn't even that sad that his father died, which further highlights how strong his father's abuse was. However, once you reach the first island and meet up with the characters that are going to make up most of the party, the story then splits its screen time between characterizing Titus, getting Titus and therefore you up to speed on the new religion and culture, and starts fleshing out the likes of Wakka, Lulu, and Yuna, the summoner. Wakka and Lulu grew up with Yuna on the island, and they become her guardians once she becomes a summoner. As it so happens, she becomes a summoner the very day Titus washes up onto the beach. There are some theories, which I happen to agree with, that suggest this isn't a mere coincidence, and it's certainly not a stretch or outlandish compared to the weird theorizing around not executing people. The events leading up to the Blitzball tournament, and even a great chunk of it after, takes the focus away from Titus almost entirely and switches it to the other characters to develop their relationships. At one point, Wakka and Lulu have a private conversation that you can eavesdrop on that's only partially about Titus, but otherwise expands on their shared history and the troubles facing them when they reach the next port city. Yuna converses with Titus about his father because she apparently met his father roughly around the same time that Titus's father disappeared. Right here is where I want to highlight the strengths of the voice acting. It's certainly not all negatives. All of the main characters have voices, and even a handful of recurring minor characters have voices. Anytime out of cutscene where you can potentially engage with any of these characters, they have dialogue. I don't mean a speech bubble. They have spoken lines. There are hundreds of instances of this throughout the game. Dialogue is one of my favorite things to write because you can get across so much characterization in what is being said. But with the added touch of voice acting, you get a clear tone, personality, and mood. It gives characters that extra layer of familiarity that helps bond you to the character to begin with. I absolutely hated Lulu to start the game, but I grew fond of her by the end, and I think that's largely due to her voice acting. By contrast, Final Fantasy XII took a step back from this. 12 came out 5 years later in 2006. It had much better technology at its disposal, and the developers had grown much more comfortable directing the voice actors, and yet they seriously cut down on the amount of voice acting. Even out of cutscenes, the main characters only have speech bubbles, which is a real shame. I never did care much for the rest of the characters in 12, and I think 12's lack of focus on the characters is the driving force behind that. There are some big moments in the Final Fantasy X story that have significant emotional impact. Getting the proper emotional response from your audience is very hard to do, and especially to be able to do it consistently. During these big emotional moments, Final Fantasy X lays it on pretty thick with decently strong voice performances and by amping up the music to a cheesy degree. But I personally think these powerful moments work because Final Fantasy X laid the groundwork with its initial slow burn characterization and the storytelling. If you watch all the cutscenes, it takes roughly 10 to 15 hours to get to the point in the story where Seymour proposes to Yuna. That's a long time. Make no mistake, the things that happen leading up to that, Tidus searching the ruins with Riku, the Blitzball tournament, Operation Mihin, and Al Bhed kidnapping Yuna for the second time, are important. The Blitzball tournament, I think, is the least important of them all, but the whole Blitzball narrative encapsulates another Al Bhed kidnapping plot, Auron making his reappearance in the game and subsequently joining your party, and the hint at Seymour's power and his desire for more power, though this isn't paid off until they're near the end of the game. I honestly think that one of the better things that Final Fantasy does is the way it executes its overlapping narratives, and all these narratives are just to expand on the characterization of the cast. Tidus, Yuna, Wakka, Lulu, and to a lesser extent, Kamari. So while I think the inciting incident for the main plot is a bit weak, these other narratives serve as strong foundation points that more than make up for its weakness. If you're not familiar with the Final Fantasy series, you should be aware that despite the numbers attached to the games, like 10 and 12, these are not sequential stories. Each game has a standalone cast of characters, and each takes place in its own world. In fact, the first game to get an official sequel was Final Fantasy X in the form of 10-2. If you think 10-2 is a silly modifier, you should look at all the Kingdom Hearts titles and try to figure out in what sequence those take place. This, of course, means that every single Final Fantasy game has to start from the ground up with world building. Each of the games often reference each other, but otherwise none of them have any contiguous connection. The amount of detail that they put into the world of Final Fantasy X is absolutely astonishing. There is a monster called Sin, and he terrorizes everything in Spira by bringing death and destruction, often in the form of gravity magic, which can cause tidal waves and ferocious winds like a hurricane. While Sin hides primarily in the ocean, it also has the ability to fly, and so communities that live inland aren't any safer. The only means of, quote, calming, unquote, Sin, as it's put, are using spiritual entities called Aeons. They're basically monsters that respond to the people who summon them. An Aeon is the soul of a person who lives in elegantly carved statues. A summoner prays to these statues for a way to defeat Sin, and the soul in the statue grants the summoner the power to call forth an Aeon. Summoners go on a pilgrimage to visit every temple in Spira, collecting all the Aeons, and then they go to the ancient ruined city of Zanarkand, where they will receive the final Aeon if they are strong enough. The final Aeon is the one that defeats Sin. The process of this ritual created a religion around it called Yevon that everyone in Spira adheres to. One of the odd and prominent tenets of Yevon is that machines are strictly forbidden. Interestingly enough, some machines aren't, like the Blitzball Stadium, but engines, war machines, and guns especially are forbidden. That is just a small but substantial slice of the world building that went into creating Spira, which I think is quite neat and a very different demonstration of a fantasy religion than I've ever seen. The Hymn of the Faith is a simple track that is hymnal in style, but it's gorgeous and feels sacred. The Aeons are all beautifully designed creatures that look fierce. I especially like Valifor and Ifrit's design. On the subject of Aeons, I would like to touch upon some theories about Final Fantasy X's story. The point of doing this is largely to show how the audience itself can be instrumental in filling in some gaps. Now, I say gaps and not holes because there is enough backstory and lore to be able to fill them in without too much trouble. There is a kind of sweet spot for providing just enough information to entice your audience without creating plot holes. That sweet spot is, of course, different for every story, but you don't have to explain every loose end that a story leaves. I'm personally a big proponent that as long as you know your full history and your full plan, that knowledge can bleed through into the narrative that a fully invested audience member can then pick up. Previously, I mentioned that Titus happened to wash up on the beach when Summoner Yuna was praying to get her first Aeon and become a full-fledged summoner. When Titus is taken into the village, the priest from the temple mentions to Wakka that it's been nearly a day since Yuna went into the temple and she's not returned. Titus gets zealous about this and breaks into the back rooms of the temple to go rescue her. When he and Wakka get to the room, right then, Yuna comes out, weak and weary, but happy with her success, because she had just become a summoner. Now, the faith that grants Aeons have grown tired of this religious ritual that they have been doing for 1,000 years. They want to end it because they will never know rest until it does, but sin has to be destroyed first. The theory goes that the faith Yuna was praying to was deliberately refusing to speak to her until she could be certain that Yuna was going to meet Titus. Given that their meeting sparks the adventure that does lead to the ritual's end, it seems likely that it wasn't mere happenstance that led to their meeting. Another popular theory that is all but outright said is that Seymour's Aeon Anima is his final Aeon. There is a scene near the end of the game where the party sees a flashback of a young Seymour crying, saying he doesn't want his mother to be an Aeon. The group later learns that in order to obtain the final Aeon, the summoner has to sacrifice one of her party members to achieve it. It's later discovered that Anima is indeed Seymour's mother. She became the final Aeon, but Seymour didn't go through with destroying Sin and instead held onto her to use her for his own ends when he tries to take control of Spira. All of the parts of the world building is the foundation with which the story rests. It would not make any sense without it, and I think it's very impressive how much effort they put into fleshing out the world of Spira. That world building is a key component for why the story of Final Fantasy X is so good and continues to have an impact to this day. Given the new trend of remaking games, I have a distinct feeling that Final Fantasy X will be one of those remakes one day. In fact, I noticed that Square Enix put up a poll to see what remake people were most excited about, and Final Fantasy X was among those options. I didn't vote on it because the truth is the PS2 remaster is perfectly acceptable. Admittedly, I'm a bit nervous about the narrative changes that they might make to modernize the game. I know Final Fantasy VII's story has undergone some revisions. Since I didn't get very far into the original Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation, I really can't comment if those revisions are good or bad. Given how high quality I think Final Fantasy X is, changes have a higher likelihood of bringing the quality down rather than improving it. But it's not a given that it will be worse. A visual update would be very welcome, though I'd hope they wouldn't lose the vibrant colors. It seems like game companies seem to think realistic translates to dirty and grimy. Please keep the vibrancy. I must insist that Matt McKenzie retain his role as Orin, or I'm going to riot. That is it for this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing and sharing it with your friends. Next episode, I'm going to be comparing book Shadow and Bones to its Netflix adaptation. I'll see you there. Until next time, this is K.O. Lynn, signing out.